What started as teenage boredom on a Michigan overpass ended with a father of 4 dead and 5 kids facing life in prison. This isn't your typical teenage prank gone wrong story. This is about how one night in October 2017 changed multiple families forever, and left everyone asking the same question: when does a stupid decision become murder? On the night of October 18, 2017, 5 teenagers from Clio High School decided to spend their evening throwing rocks off Interstate 75 overpasses in Vienna Township, about 80 miles north of Detroit. What they thought would be harmless fun turned into one of Michigan's most shocking cases involving minors. The victim was Kenneth White, a 32-year-old construction worker who was riding in the passenger seat of a work van, heading home after a long day on the job. But here's where this case gets even more disturbing. These teens weren't just randomly throwing rocks. According to court documents and police investigations, they were playing what they called a game, a sick, twisted game, called overpassing. The rules were simple and horrifying. They would throw objects from overpasses at moving cars below, and hitting a car, which they called getting a dinkper, earned them points. The 5 teens involved were Kyle Anger, who was 17, Mikaden Payne, who was 16, Trevor Gray, who was 15, Alexander Miller, who was 15, and Mark Sikelski, who was 16. These weren't troubled kids from broken homes or gang members. They were regular high school students from the Flint area who made a decision that night that would haunt them forever. All 5 attended Clio High School and seemed like typical teenagers to anyone who knew them. Let me paint you a detailed picture of what happened that fatal night, because the timeline of events shows just how calculated and prolonged their dangerous behavior was. Kenneth White had just finished his shift as a construction worker. He was tired, probably looking forward to getting home to his family. He was riding as a passenger in a work van with a coworker, traveling southbound on Interstate 75. It was a routine drive home, something Kenneth had done countless times before. Meanwhile, about 20 miles away, 5 teenagers were looking for something to do on what seemed like an ordinary Wednesday night. They ended up on the Dodge Road overpass, which crosses over I-75. What started as typical teenage boredom quickly escalated into something far more dangerous than any of them could have imagined, or so they claimed later. But here's what makes this case so much more sinister than it first appeared. According to Genesee County Sheriff Robert Pickle, his office was investigating numerous incidents of reports where these same teens had allegedly thrown other large objects from overpasses. Before the night Kenneth White was killed, they had allegedly thrown a couch and a shopping cart from overpasses in previous incidents. This wasn't their first time engaging in this deadly game. The night Kenneth died, the teens weren't content with just throwing small rocks. They had loaded up Kyle Anger's pickup truck with large rocks specifically for this purpose. They were actively seeking out heavy objects to throw at innocent people driving below them. This shows premeditation and planning that goes far beyond a spur of a moment and teenage prank. The fatal rock that killed Kenneth White weighed 6 pounds. That's equivalent to holding a heavy dumbbell weight and dropping it from an overpass onto moving traffic below. To put this in perspective, when a 6-pound object falls from an overpass onto a vehicle traveling at highway speeds, the impact force is devastating. Physics doesn't lie. This was essentially a lethal weapon being dropped onto unsuspecting drivers. When that rock crashed through the windshield of Kenneth's van, it struck him in both the chest and face with tremendous force. The rock hit Kenneth in the face and head first, fracturing his skull, then ricocheted to his chest, causing massive internal trauma. The impact was so severe that Kenneth White died from blunt force trauma instantly. He didn't have time to say goodbye to anyone. He didn't have time to think about his children or his fiancée. 1 second he was alive and looking forward to getting home, and the next second he was gone forever, leaving his coworker behind the wheel, traumatized, and Kenneth's family destroyed. But here's what makes this case even more heartbreaking and infuriating. Kenneth left behind his fiancée, Amy Cagle, and 4 children, including a 5-year-old son. Think about that, a 5-year-old who would never see their father come home from work again because some teenagers thought it would be fun to play a deadly game with people's lives. Amy Cagle had to sit down with a 5-year-old child and explain that daddy was never coming home. Imagine having to have that conversation with a child who doesn't understand why bad things happen to good people. Kenneth's brother, Thomas, spoke about the type of man Kenneth was. He said Kenneth worked long hours to support his family, always putting his children and fiancé first. He was the kind of father who would come home tired from a construction job but still make time to help with homework or read bedtime stories. He was building a life with Amy, planning their future together, dreaming about watching their children grow up. All of that was ripped away in an instant by teenagers, who saw human beings as targets in their sick game. What's crucial to understand about this case is that this wasn't a single moment of poor judgment or an accidental tragedy. Police investigations revealed that the teenagers had damaged several other cars that night before they killed Kenneth White. They had been systematically throwing rocks off at least 2 different overpasses in Vienna Township, turning what should have been a safe drive home for multiple families into a terrifying ordeal. According to investigators, the teens confessed that they had thrown multiple rocks at cars driving south on I-75. From their position on the Dodge Road overpass, they were methodically targeting vehicle after vehicle, playing their twisted point-scoring game with people's lives. Each car they hit was someone's parent, someone's child, someone's spouse or sibling trying to get home safely. If you're finding this as shocking and infuriating as I am, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We dive deep into cases like this every week on Accused. The immediate aftermath of Kenneth's death sent shockwaves through multiple communities. Amy Cagle spoke with local media shortly after learning that 5 teens were facing murder charges in the incident that killed her fiancé as he was riding home from work. The pain and disbelief in her voice was evident as she tried to process how a senseless act of violence had torn her family apart and left her children without a father. At court proceedings, Amy Cagle gave a tearful and heartbreaking account of the night she learned about Kenneth's death. She said, "Ken's sister called me at work, hysterically crying. She told me Kenneth is dead. I couldn't even acknowledge it at first." This gives you an idea of the shock and complete disbelief that Kenneth's family experienced. One moment he was alive and well, texting goodnight to his children, heading home from another day of honest work, and the next moment he was gone forever because of a group of bored teenagers. What makes Amy's statement even more powerful is what she said about the senseless nature of Kenneth's death. She told reporters, "For some senseless act, for it to be just a rock, just to take him so soon. I just don't understand what a person could be thinking to even want to do something like that." Her words capture the incomprehensible nature of this tragedy, how something so preventable and pointless could destroy so many lives in an instant. The investigation moved quickly once police realized they were dealing with a homicide rather than a freak accident. Kyle Anger, who was identified as the ringleader and the one who actually threw the fatal rock, turned himself in at the Genesee County Jail. The other 4 were arrested shortly after. All 5 were initially charged with second-degree murder, conspiracy to commit second-degree murder, and malicious destruction of property. In Michigan, second-degree murder carries a potential life sentence, which means these teenagers were facing the possibility of spending the rest of their lives in prison. But here's where the legal complexities begin, and where this case becomes a study in how the justice system handles juvenile offenders in cases involving death. The prosecutors initially moved to charge all 5 teens as adults, arguing that the severity of the crime, the premeditation involved, and the complete disregard for human life warranted adult consequences regardless of their ages. Kyle Anger, being identified as both the ringleader and the one who threw the fatal rock, became the central figure in the prosecution's case. He was described in court documents as the one who loaded up his pickup truck with rocks specifically for the purpose of throwing them at cars. He wasn't just a follower going along with someone else's bad idea, he was actively planning and organizing this deadly activity. During the legal proceedings, more disturbing details emerged about the nature of their game. Prosecutor David Layton revealed in court that the teens had turned throwing objects at cars into a competitive activity, where they kept score. They called successful hits dingers and awarded points based on the type of vehicle they hit and the damage they caused. This wasn't random mischief, it was organized, systematic targeting of innocent people. The psychological profile that emerged during the investigation was deeply troubling. These weren't kids who made one terrible decision in a moment of poor judgment. They had created an entire system around endangering people's lives for entertainment. They had rules, they kept score, and they had done it before. This suggests a level of disconnect from human empathy that goes beyond normal teenage risk-taking behavior. Kyle Anger eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for other charges being dropped. This plea deal was controversial, because many people felt that someone who had systematically planned to throw deadly objects at innocent people should face the full consequences of their actions, but the prosecution likely agreed to the plea to avoid the uncertainty of a trial, and to ensure that Anger would face significant prison time, at his sentencing hearing in October 2019, Kyle Anger, who had turned 19 by then, was sentenced to 39 months to 20 years in prison, with credit for the 740 days he had already served in jail. Since his arrest in October 2017, he was also required to pay $7,000 in restitution to Kenneth White's family, a sum that seems almost insultingly small compared to the life that was lost and the ongoing suffering of Kenneth's children and fiancé. But here's what really upset Kenneth White's family and sparked outrage in the community. Kyle Anger served only about 15 months in actual prison before being released on parole in January 2021. Think about that for a moment. Kenneth White is gone forever. His children will never have their father walk them down the aisle at their weddings. His fiancée will never grow old with the man she loved. His youngest child, who was only 5 when Kenneth died, will have almost no memories of his father. But the person who caused all of this pain and destruction was back on the streets after serving just over a year in prison. The legal journey for the other 4 defendants became even more complicated and controversial. Mark Sikelski, Trevor Gray, Mickadine Payne, and Alexander Miller initially faced the same second-degree murder charges as Kyle Anger. However, their cases became entangled in complex legal battles about juvenile versus adult sentencing that would drag on for years. Initially, a Genesee County judge ruled that all 4 would be sentenced as adults, arguing that their participation in the deadly game warranted adult consequences. But this decision was appealed, leading to a lengthy court battle that would ultimately result in very different outcomes for the 4 teens. The complexity of their cases came down to fundamental questions in juvenile justice that don't have easy answers. Should teenagers who participate in activities that result in death be held to the same standard as the person who directly caused the death? In this case, while Kyle Anger threw the fatal rock, all 5 teens were actively participating in the dangerous game of throwing objects at moving vehicles. They were all keeping score, they all knew the risks, and they all chose to continue even after seeing the damage they were causing to other vehicles. Defense attorneys argued that the 4 younger defendants were followers rather than leaders, and that their age and brain development should be considered in sentencing. They pointed to scientific research showing that teenage brains aren't fully developed, particularly in areas responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and understanding long-term consequences. But prosecutors argued that regardless of their ages, these teens made choices that resulted in someone's death, and they should face consequences proportional to the harm they caused. They emphasized that this wasn't accidental. The teens had deliberately and systematically targeted vehicles with dangerous objects, fully aware that they could seriously injure or kill someone. The legal battle went all the way to the Michigan Court of Appeals, which ultimately ruled in May 2021 that the original judge had exceeded his authority. In some aspects of the case, the appeals court allowed the adult charges against the 4 younger defendants to be dropped, meaning they would be sentenced in the juvenile system rather than as adults. This ruling led to dramatically different outcomes for the 4 defendants. In August 2021, Mark Sikelski, Trevor Gray, and Mickadine Payne were sentenced to 1-year probation and 100 hours of community service. The 4th defendant, Alexander Miller, received a similar sentence. After completing their probation, these 3 defendants would have no felony record, essentially allowing them to move on with their lives as if this tragedy had never happened. The massive disparity in sentences became a source of intense controversy and frustration for many people following the case, especially Kenneth White's family. From their perspective, all 5 teenagers were equally responsible for Kenneth's death, regardless of who physically threw the fatal rock. They felt that the light sentences for 4 of the defendants didn't reflect the severity of what happened, or provide any real justice for Kenneth's death. Kenneth White's father expressed his unhappiness about the lack of substantial prison time for most of the suspects. While he understood that he couldn't change the judicial system or the court's decisions, his frustration was palpable. Here was a man who had lost his son to a senseless act of violence, watching as 4 of the 5 people responsible received what amounted to a slap on the wrist. The psychological and social factors that contributed to this tragedy raised disturbing questions about teenage behavior, social media influence, and the culture of online pranks and stunts. These teens grew up in the era of viral videos, where dangerous and extreme behavior is often celebrated and rewarded with views, likes, and social media fame. There's a concerning trend among young people to escalate risky behavior in pursuit of social media attention or peer approval. What might have started as small acts of mischief can quickly escalate into life-threatening behavior. When teenagers feed off each other's energy and push boundaries further and further. The concept of their overpassing game, with its point system and competitive element, shows how they had gamified violence against innocent people. They had turned human beings into targets in their entertainment system, completely divorced from the reality that these were real people with families, hopes, dreams, and the right to drive home safely from work. Group psychology research tells us that teenagers in groups often engage in riskier behavior than they would as individuals. There's a phenomenon called risky shift, where group decisions tend to be more extreme than individual decisions. When you combine this with teenage brain development, peer pressure, and the desire to impress friends, you can see how a group of seemingly normal kids could escalate into deadly behavior. But what makes this case particularly chilling is the premeditation involved. This wasn't a group of kids who found some rocks and impulsively threw them. Kyle Anger had loaded up his pickup truck with rocks specifically for this purpose. They had driven to multiple overpasses. They had turned it into a scoring game. This level of planning and organization suggests something much more disturbing than typical teenage impulsivity. The impact on Kenneth White's family extends far beyond the immediate tragedy of his death. His children, especially his youngest who was only 5, will grow up with limited or no memories of their father. They'll miss out on countless moments, birthday parties where dad isn't there, school events without his support, graduations he won't attend, and weddings where he won't walk them down the aisle. Amy Cagle not only lost her partner and the father of her children, but she also had to become a single parent overnight. She had to figure out how to support her family financially while dealing with her own grief and trauma. She had to be strong for her children while falling apart inside. She had to explain to them why their father wasn't coming home, something no parent should ever have to do. The surviving children will also face psychological challenges that may last their entire lives. Studies show that children who lose a parent to violence often struggle with trust issues, anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress. They may blame themselves, wondering if there was something they could have done to prevent it. They may live in fear that other people they love could be taken away suddenly and violently. Kenneth's coworker, who was driving the van when the rock crashed through the windshield, is often overlooked in discussions of this case. This person witnessed their friend and colleague die instantly right next to them. They experienced the shock of the impact, the immediate realization that Kenneth was dead, and the trauma of having to safely stop the vehicle while processing what had just happened. The psychological impact of witnessing something like this can last a lifetime. The community impact was also significant. The case sent shockwaves through the Clio area and beyond, as parents struggled to understand how teenagers from their community could engage in such deadly behavior. It forced difficult conversations about teenage supervision, the influence of social media and online content, and the question of whether parents truly know what their children are capable of. As Genesee County Sheriff Robert Pickle said at the time, "Nobody wins when young people are charged. A young boy is left without a father, and many families are grieving." This case created ripple effects throughout multiple communities, affecting not just the immediate families but also friends, classmates, teachers, and neighbors who had to grapple with the reality of what had happened. The families of the 5 defendants also became victims in their own way. Parents who thought they were raising normal, decent kids suddenly found themselves dealing with murder charges and the reality that their children had killed someone. They had to face their community, deal with media attention, and confront the fact that they might not have known their children as well as they thought they did. Defense attorneys and family members described the defendants as just dumb kids who made a terrible mistake. One defense attorney, Frank Manley, argued that his clients deserved a second chance because they were juveniles who didn't fully understand the consequences of their actions. But this characterization angered many people who felt it minimized the severity of what happened and showed a lack of respect for Kenneth White's life and his family's suffering. Kyle Anger has spoken publicly about his journey since the incident, and his statements provide some insight into his mindset. In interviews after his release from prison, he said, "I blame myself for what happened." He acknowledged that his actions led to Kenneth White's death and expressed remorse for the pain he caused. However, many people question whether his relatively short time in prison was sufficient consequence for taking someone's life. In a 2024 interview with ABC 12 News, one of the other defendants, Alexander Miller, reached out to share his perspective on how the incident had changed his life. He discussed his journey since 2017 and his attempts to make amends for his actions. However, his willingness to speak publicly about his experience was met with mixed reactions from the public, with some seeing it as genuine remorse and others viewing it as an attempt to rehabilitate his image. The debate about juvenile justice is particularly complex in this case because it involves multiple defendants of different ages who played different roles in the crime. Kyle Anger, as the oldest, and the one who threw the fatal rock, received adult sentencing, but the others, who were younger and characterized as followers, ultimately received juvenile sentences. Current brain science supports the argument that adolescent brains aren't fully developed until the mid-20s, particularly in areas responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and understanding long-term consequences. This research has led to reforms in juvenile justice that emphasize rehabilitation over punishment for young offenders. However, critics argue that this scientific understanding shouldn't excuse violent behavior that results in death. They point out that teenagers understand that throwing heavy objects at moving vehicles is dangerous and could kill someone. The fact that they continued this behavior despite seeing the damage they were causing to other vehicles suggests they knew exactly what they were doing. The case also raises questions about whether the juvenile justice system is equipped to handle cases where minors commit serious violent crimes. Traditional juvenile rehabilitation programs are designed for less serious offenses and may not be appropriate for cases involving death and such a high level of premeditation and disregard for human life. What's particularly frustrating for many people following this case is the perception that the punishment didn't fit the crime. Kenneth White is gone forever, but most of his killers received sentences that allow them to move on with their lives relatively quickly. This creates a sense of injustice that extends beyond Kenneth's family to the broader community. The case continues to be discussed in legal circles as an example of the challenges involved in prosecuting juveniles for serious crimes. It highlights the tension between the desire for justice and accountability on one hand, and the belief in rehabilitation and second chances for young people on the other hand. Looking at the broader implications of this case, it serves as a stark reminder of how social media culture and the gamification of dangerous behavior can contribute to real-world violence. The teens' overpassing game, with its point system and competitive element, reflects a disturbing trend of turning violence into entertainment. The case also highlights the random nature of tragedy, and how ordinary people going about their daily lives can become victims of senseless violence. Kenneth White was simply trying to get home from work, something millions of people do every day without thinking about the risks. The fact that his life could be ended so suddenly and senselessly by the poor decisions of strangers is a sobering reminder of how fragile life can be. For Kenneth's children, especially his youngest, who is now a teenager, this case represents the loss of their entire childhood as they knew it. They've grown up without their father, missing out on countless moments that make up a lifetime. Every milestone in their lives, graduations, achievements, relationships, future weddings and children will be marked by his absence. The financial impact on Kenneth's family should also not be overlooked. Losing the primary breadwinner suddenly meant that Amy Cagle had to figure out how to support 4 children on her own. The $7,000 in restitution ordered from Kyle Anger is a tiny fraction of what Kenneth would have earned over his lifetime to support his family. Kenneth's brother Thomas set up a GoFundMe page to help Kenneth's family with expenses, highlighting the ongoing financial struggles they faced after losing Kenneth's income. This practical impact is often forgotten in discussions of violent crime, but it's a reality that victims' families have to deal with long after the media attention fades and the legal proceedings end. The case has also become a cautionary tale about the importance of parental supervision and awareness of what teenagers are doing in their free time. The fact that 5 teenagers were able to load up a truck with rocks, drive to multiple overpasses, and systematically target vehicles for hours without any adult intervention raises questions about where the parents thought their children were, and what they thought they were doing. While it's impossible for parents to supervise their teenagers every moment, this case highlights the importance of knowing who your children are spending time with, what they're doing, and whether they're engaging in risky or dangerous behavior. It also underscores the need for parents to have serious conversations with their teenagers about consequences, empathy, and the value of human life. The long-term psychological impact on the defendants themselves is also worth considering. While they may have received relatively light sentences, they will have to live with the knowledge of what they did for the rest of their lives. Kyle Anger in particular, will always know that his actions directly resulted in someone's death and caused immeasurable pain to an entire family. As these young men move forward with their lives, they'll have to find ways to make amends for what they did and to ensure that they never engage in such behavior again. Some may genuinely change and dedicate their lives to making a positive impact. Others may struggle with guilt, shame, and the weight of their actions. The true test of the juvenile justice system's approach will be whether these individuals become productive members of society or whether they continue to engage in dangerous behavior. The Kenneth White case serves as a reminder that actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences are permanent and devastating. It's a tragedy that never should have happened, but it did. And now everyone involved, the victim's family, the defendants and their families, and the broader community has to find a way to live with the aftermath. What makes this case so particularly heartbreaking is its preventability. If any one of those 5 teenagers had said this is too dangerous or we could kill someone, Kenneth White would still be alive today. If any of them had shown even a moment of empathy for the innocent people they were targeting, this tragedy could have been avoided. Instead, they chose to continue their deadly game, escalating their violence until it reached its inevitable conclusion. They turned human beings into targets for their entertainment. And when their game finally killed someone, they tried to dismiss it as just a prank that went wrong. The case also raises difficult questions about forgiveness and redemption. How do we balance the need for justice and accountability with the possibility of rehabilitation and second chances? How do we ensure that young people learn from their mistakes without destroying their entire futures? How do we protect society while still believing in the possibility of change and growth? These are questions without easy answers. And different people will come to different conclusions based on their values, experiences, and beliefs about justice and human nature. What's clear is that Kenneth White deserved better. He deserved to come home to his family that night. He deserved to see his children grow up. He deserved to grow old with his fiancée. He deserved to live a full and happy life. Instead, his life was cut short by teenagers who saw him not as a human being with hopes and dreams and people who loved him, but as a target in their twisted game. That's the true tragedy of this case, not just that someone died, but that he died for no reason other than some bored teenager's entertainment. What do you think about this case? Was justice truly served with these sentences? Should teenagers who cause deaths through reckless acts face the same penalties as adults? How do we balance rehabilitation with punishment when it comes to juvenile offenders who commit serious, violent crimes? Should the justice system consider the role that social media culture and online content played in influencing these teenagers' behavior? These are complex questions that deserve serious discussion. The Kenneth White case forces us to confront difficult truths about violence, responsibility, and justice in our society. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Accused for more deep dives into cases that make you question everything about crime and justice. Until next time, stay safe out there, and remember that behind every statistic and every news headline is a real person with a real family who deserves justice and remembrance.